Welcome, please take a seat. Welcome to this program of Radboud Reflects, the Center for Contemporary European Philosophy and Kenniscentrum Frankrijk, Nederland, all from Radboud University. My name is Dave Willems. I work at Radboud Reflects, and today we have a special guest here from New York. His name is Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Today we're going to talk about Islam and philosophy, but let me first introduce our speaker of today. He studied in France. He also taught at the University of Dakar, in which a former speaker of Radboud Reflects and Center for Contemporary European Philosophy, Ibrahim Tube, also came, and also a university which cooperates a lot with this university. At the moment, he teaches France and philosophy at the University of Columbia, and he has a special focus on Islamic and African philosophy. The topic of the lecture, what I already taught, is Islam and philosophy, and Professor Diagne is going to focus on two important questions in his lecture. First one is, how can the teaching of philosophy play an important role in Muslim societies today again? A role which it played before, but now, due circumstances which Professor Diagne is going to tell us about, suddenly disappeared. And the second question is, how can Islamic philosophy play an important role in our society here today? So how can the teaching of philosophy play an important role in the rest of the world? After his lecture, there is going to be a discussion. The lecture will take about 45 minutes. The discussion will be with Professor Evert van der Zweerde. He is a political philosopher at Radboud University. I should say social and political philosopher at Radboud University. The discussion will be moderated by my colleague Liesbeth Jansen. And the points of discussion will be the tension between philosophy and religion. And next, this about the important mission of Professor Diagne. How can Islamic philosophy play an important role in the world again? At the end of the lecture, there will be a possibility to buy books, because Professor Diagne is here because Paul van der Wiel, who is also somewhere over here, is over here. He translated the book is Filosoferen in Islam to Dutch. And Professor Diagne will be happy to signing books after the lecture. That will be all. So I want to wish you a very pleasant evening and enjoy.
I have first and foremost many words of thanks to share. Well, first of all, thank you for coming, for being here. I would also like to thank my colleagues of Nijmegen Nijmegen for making this possible, and the colleagues that I have met in Dakar and that I am very happy to find here again, and the colleagues that I came to know. I would like to have a special mention from Philippe that I am very happy to find here again, and come back to what was being said by Dave earlier about Paul. And I would like from the bottom of my heart to thank Paul. I cannot read Dutch at all. It is a strange feeling to have a book with my name, even my picture on the back of it, feel that I am familiar with what is in it, hopefully, but still be absolutely unable to know what it is. But from the exchange we had, the wonderful exchange I had with Paul, all the questions he asked me, I know that he did this in a very professional, very conscientious way, and I wanted to take this opportunity to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you to you. I'm sure that you have made in Dutch a better book than I made in French. Allow me to start here with an anecdote. This morning, I was looking at my notes in my beautiful hotel chosen for me, and one of the women from management came to see me and asked, what is it that you do? And I say, I'm a professor. Professor of what? I say, I'm a professor of philosophy. She said, oh my goodness, philosophy makes that effect usually. Oh my goodness. What kind of philosophy do you do? And I say, well, I started doing philosophy of science, but I am here because of the history of philosophy in the Islamic world, because I wrote a book called Philosophy in Islam. And she said, you know what? She had a very focused expression, and she said, you know, I believe that we need to hear about that here. And she added, and I'm sure also Muslims probably need to hear about that. And I was almost ready to hug her. I said, you know, this is exactly what I'm planning to do this evening. So if you allow me, I would like to quote you in our conversation at the beginning of my presentation. And I have her permission for doing that. So let me start by recalling an incident that happened in January of this year in Morocco. That incident is related in the issue dated January 28, 2017, in the French newspaper Le Monde. It is about a rallying by philosophy teachers in Morocco against newly revised textbooks in Islamic education. The colleagues, the teachers of philosophy in Morocco had been shocked, the article said, to find in a textbook, normally for junior high school students, under the chapter heading Philosophy and Faith, a definition of philosophy as, I quote, a product of human thought contrary to Islam, end of quote. In fact, that quote in that textbook is from a 13th century figure, an Iraqi religious leader in the study of tradition, Ibn Salah Ash-Shahrazuri, who died in 1245, by mid-13th century. And he was mainly known for his violent attacks against philosophy. For that reason, his name is often associated with that of another Muslim theologian and scholar, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. I'll come back to him. But as we will see, I believe that it is unfair to the latter to consider his positions to be the same as these fulminations against philosophy coming from Ash-Shahrazuri, who went as far as opposing logic even. I'll come back to that. So the members of the Moroccan Association of Philosophy Teachers organized sit-ins to denounce an attack against what they perceived as, they organized these sit-ins against what they perceived as an attack against freedom of thought. And they saw it also as an attack against democracy. And they declared that they were totally appalled to see a resurgence of hatred for reason and rationalism in a modern Muslim country like Morocco. And it is true that Morocco is often associated with the idea of an open and dynamic Islam. In response to those protests, the Ministry of Education in Morocco made it clear that the textbook was just quoting Ash-Shahrazuri as an illustration of one given position on the question of the relationship between philosophy and faith. And the minister said, we are not endorsing any kind of doctrine. We are just proposing a text, a quote, to be submitted to the students' examination and their critical thinking. At any rate, and this is why I am evoking these events in the beginning of my lecture, at any rate, that crisis apropos textbooks convey two main lessons concerning the teaching of philosophy in particular, the history of philosophy in Muslim countries and everywhere. So I will consider to look at that crisis and the meaning it has for us. I will consider 3 points. First of all, the meaning of the kind of opposition to philosophy that was represented by this theologian, Ash-Shahrazuri. Second point that I'm going to consider, I will insist on the importance of teaching philosophy today in Muslim societies and countries as a way of promoting critical thinking and pluralism. And I will say that this is, in fact, not something new, but just a simple reconnection of Islam with its own traditions, intellectual tradition, and its own philosophy of movement, as I say. And my third point would be now the importance of making Islamic philosophy a component of the curriculum everywhere, and in particular, the curriculum in philosophy, in departments of philosophy. So those are the 2 main points that I'm going to consider before opening it for discussion. So, first of all, what is the meaning of that quote coming from Ash-Shahrazuri, and what does it teach us concerning the history of a certain opposition to philosophy? And when I say here philosophy, I have in mind the appropriation by the word of Islam of Greek philosophy. Now, the expansion, speaking precisely of Greek philosophy, the expansion of the word of Islam has meant at one point the incorporation of centers of teaching of Greek philosophy and sciences, as in 632, which is the year when the Prophet of Islam, alayhi salam, passed away, the Arabic Peninsula basically had become Muslim. Very soon after his passing, countries, lands, regions such as present-day Iraq, Syria, etc., became incorporated in the Muslim world. And these were centers of, in those regions, you had centers of the teaching of philosophy and Greek philosophy. So physically, those centers, the tradition of Greek philosophy was incorporated in the word of Islam. And then the question was soon raised about what to make of that pagan love of wisdom as the meaning of philosophy goes, as you know. Here, having said that, I have to make a precision, because I have said that philosophy, I understand it as Greek philosophy. Having said that, I have to make a precision. Actually, philosophical questioning and inquiry was not just brought in by the Greek tradition. Philosophical questioning and inquiry were already present in the word of Islam among scholars, and in particular theologians, who would raise questions that appear debatable, even if you call for the arbitration of the Quran. Among those questions, the most important, to give you examples, were the question of human free will versus predestination. Another important question, the relationship between the essence of God and his attributes. I was discussing that with a colleague earlier when we were having dinner. Those are the type of questions of philosophical and theological questions, if you will, that were already present in the word of Islam in a totally independent way from the encounter with Greek philosophy. To just explain roughly the nature of these theological questions, these questions around which Islamic theology is going to be born, obviously, if you ask yourself, is the human being free to act the way they act, or are they predetermined to act the way they act? classical question of free will versus predestination. As I say, this is a question which is debatable, and you can't just say, okay, let's open the Quran and decide what does it say, because you could very well find verses that go one direction, that seem to support the thesis that human beings are free to act the way they act, or the other way around. So you cannot avoid philosophizing. Same way with the question of the attributes. What are the relationship between the essence of God, the oneness of God, and the attributes of God in their multiplicity? If you have all these attributes, in particular the anthropomorphic attribute would be problematic, but not even just the anthropomorphic attributes. Any kind of attribute would seem to be questioning the oneness of God. So these were the type of questions with which Muslim scholars, theologians, were already grappling before that encounter with Greek philosophy. That precision being made, now I come back to the question of that Greek philosophy, meaning also Greek sciences. Two opposite attitudes were possible in face of philosophy, Greek philosophy. One was the attitude of self-closure. You just say, well, we are the word of revelation. We have revelation, so why should we get interested in the wisdom of those people who did not have revelation? That is one possible attitude. Here also I need to make a remark, because this was not just the case for Islam. Actually, all the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, when they encountered Greek philosophy, had at first the same attitude. How could we actually find anything worthy of us in this pagan wisdom? And just a reminder that in 522, Emperor Justinian, when he became a Christian, when he converted to Christianity, closed the schools of philosophy in Athens and Alexandria, precisely on that ground that these were pagan schools of thought. And the philosophers had to flee, those centers had to flee from his religious zeal. So this was not characteristic of just the Islamic world. This is one possible attitude vis-à-vis Greek philosophy. Opposite to that, you would have openness to knowledge coming from elsewhere. The affirmation that knowledge, even coming from them, pagan people, is useful and could even be seen as recommended by prophetic traditions about the pursuit of knowledge, even if one has to travel to China, or about the word of wisdom being the lost property of the Muslim. Saying that, I am here alluding to two traditions that you find in Islamic texts of traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. One of them says that the Prophet recommended, go seek knowledge even if you have to travel to China for that. And certain versions add to that, go in the pursuit of knowledge from your cradle to your tomb. But the idea of saying, seek knowledge even if you have to travel to China for that, was used by the people who recommended a certain openness to Greek philosophy and Greek sciences by saying, you see, if you understand fully that tradition, you will understand that no matter where it comes from, any knowledge is useful to us. Because if the Prophet was meaning the Islamic sciences, he would not have sent his companions to China. After all, until today, the Quran is not in China. Okay? The traditions are not in China. The science of Arabic revelation is not in China. So when he told them, seek knowledge even if you travel to you have to travel to China, he was not meaning religious knowledge or the disciplines coming from the study of the Quran. That was one way of finding a foundation, a traditional foundation for the openness to Greek philosophy. Another tradition that could have been evoked by people who were in favor of that second attitude was to recall another prophetic tradition saying, the word of wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he has a right to it. He has more right to it than anybody else. The interest of this second hadith, this second tradition, is that actually it talks about wisdom, hikmah, which could be related to philosophy, precisely, saying that the word of wisdom is the lost property of the Muslim, of the believer, that the believer should consider that anywhere he finds a word of wisdom, that is his property or her property, and which was lost, then it becomes a duty to reappropriate it. That was also an attitude of opening. So, and openness. So I wanted to contrast these two attitudes for two reasons. Because historically, the hesitation was there, what to do with Greek philosophy. And second, because this tension between the two actually will never end in the word of Islam. It will come back again and again in different forms, and we might say that today the word of Islam is witnessing another form of that tension between this openness to the word in general and self-closure on the other hand. Now, historically, in the first centuries, under the dynasty of the Abbasid, very quickly, as you know, in the chronology of Islam, you have the succession of the four first leaders at the head of the community, which ended in 661 with the assassination of the last caliph, last of the four well-guided caliph, as they are called, Ali, followed by a dynasty of the Umayyad, which was mainly a dynasty of warriors, and followed by the dynasty of the Abbasid in 751, which is going to last until 1258. And that dynasty is more associated with the brilliance in intellectual terms of the Islamic civilization, with the creation of the capital, Baghdad. So it is under the dynasty of the Abbasid that the second, or is it the first, the second attitude of openness found some political backing. Before that, it was an intellectual question, what to do with Greek philosophy, and it became something that was backed by the political power of the Abbasid afterwards. So one date that marks that symbolically is the creation by one Abbasid caliph of an institution in Baghdad called the House of Wisdom, which was an institution devoted to the translation of Greek philosophy into Arabic. Of course, scholars did not wait for the caliph to give them permission to engage in translation and to engage with Greek philosophy. Thanks God, usually academics do not wait for the political power to let them know what they should be doing. They do it. But in this case, this backing by the political power had some kind of very important effect in this case. So the movement of appropriation started, went very fast, started with translation first, and then true appropriation in the sense that the people who were working at the House of Wisdom were not just translators anymore, they were full-fledged philosophers who would use the language of Greek philosophy to deal with questions that are more connected to their own faith and to their own culture. So this is one way in which that tension between openness or self-closure was at that time solved. But the opposition, again, to the foreign wisdom never ceased and reappeared again and again in different forms. Now you can even tell it from the name it took. It adopted as a discipline the name falsafa, which is just an Arabization of the Greek philosophia. So somehow the name itself marked the foreignness of that discipline. It is only after the 12th century that the name started disappearing really and being replaced by the Arabic word for wisdom, which could have been the first translation in the first place, the word hikmah. This opposition reappearing will take the form at one point of the opposition of grammarians to the movement of translation, because this is a very interesting and important phenomenon. A language, and this is the basis of translation studies, when you translate, you change the language which receives something. That happened with Latin. We can remember here the work of Cicero, translating for the first time Greek philosophy into Latin. When we go back to revisit that history, it is very interesting to remember that although Latin has become very quickly, especially in the medieval ages, the language of philosophy, it is always interesting to read that in connection with what Cicero was doing when he was translating for the first time Greek concepts, asking himself whether his own Latin language was capable of carrying Greek philosophy. And of course, the answer would be yes, historically. But in so doing, he was also reflecting on the best way to adapt Latin to the movement of becoming philosophical, the way in which the language became philosophical. The same thing happened to Arabic, to the Arabic language. In order to translate Greek philosophy, you had not only to create new words, neologism, but also new even ways of speaking. And that was a deep transformation of the language. Let me give you a simple example. In philosophical jargon, we love to talk about the quiddity of something. It's always beautiful in a bar to talk about the quiddity of something. You can appear brilliant to whoever is in the bar with you. So, but how is that word created? You take the word what, quid in Latin, and you add the itas, which in Latin indicates a substantive. So the quiditas of a thing is the whatness of the thing. What is it? And the whatness of this is that it is a glass of water, and I have a sip, if you allow me. That's the kind of trick that philosophers play, and then they appear very brilliant after that. Well, Quiditas did that from the Greek. The Arab translators are going to do the same thing. They take the Arabic kaifa, how? Kaifa haluka, how are you doing? And they added a kaifiya, iya being the equivalent of itas. Then instead of how are you doing, you would ask what is your commonness? How your howness instead of your highness. So that is again the trick. And the reaction to philosophy, the opposition to philosophy this time took the form of the reaction of grammarians to the transformation of the language of revelation. The interesting thing when we think of the becoming philosophical of the Arabic language is precisely to look at the way in which the opposition at that time took the form of an opposition to new forms of transforming the language. And it is in a context like that that one could understand the rebound, as I would call it, of the first attitude of self-closure that is represented by Ibn Salah al-Kurdi Shahrazuri. The attack here is truly on a legal basis, because in his case, it is not just saying, well, this kind of wisdom is just the wisdom of the pagans. It takes a legal form when he says that philosophers are actually heretics. So this Salah al-Kurdi al-Shahrazuri, whose quote was at the origin of all the protests in Morocco that I mentioned earlier, was a specialist of exegesis. He was born in 1181 in Sharazur, as his name Sharazuri indicates, which is in the Kurdistan part of Iraq today. And he died, as I said before, in the middle of the 13th century in 1245. So he taught, he was a theologian who was teaching also in Jerusalem. He taught in Jerusalem and he taught in Damascus. And he is known for this radical condemnation of philosophy that he called degeneration, confusion, misguidance, motivated by perversion and blasphemy. So for him, basically philosophers were all in hell or should be sent to hell. And to that state of confusion of philosophers, he opposed what he considered to be the clarity of Sharia. And he went as far as actually not even considering that logic was acceptable, because usually even people who were opposed to Greek philosophy would consider that logic, which is the preparatory discipline when you do philosophy, as you know, the texts, the Aristotelian texts of logic are regrouped under the name organon, organon meaning a tool, an instrument, because logic is supposed to be the instrument that one has to master in order to do logic. You have to do philosophy. Before you do philosophy, you have to master the science of valid reasoning, recognize what is a valid reasoning in the first place. For him, not even logic was acceptable. He considered that logic was some form of Trojan horse for metaphysics and physics. You start with logic, you give them logic, and you end up having to concede too many things that are not acceptable for the faith. Now, it has been argued in the controversy that happened in Morocco, from which I started. They say, well, Shahrazuri has attacked philosophy, but Al-Ghazali, Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, also has attacked philosophy. I would argue here very quickly that it is not the same thing. And let me say a couple of words about Al-Ghazali, who is relatively known, but if you do not know him, Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, whose name had been Latinized as Al-Ghazal in medieval times, was a theologian who lived in Baghdad in the 12th century, in the 11th century, and died in the early 12th century. And he was a very prominent figure. And it is true that he wrote against philosophy. Earlier this afternoon, I had the pleasure of being hosted by the Association of Muslim Students of Nijmegen University, and I was asked a question about Al-Ghazali writing a book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of philosophers. He wrote a book attacking philosophers that he titled The Incoherence of Philosophers. And he also accused philosophers of being heretics. He said that they were wrong on account of 20 theses, and they were particularly heretic on 3 different theses. One, because they were affirming the eternity of the word instead of its creation ex nihilo in 6 days, to take the text literally. And also he said they were negating the resurrection of bodies in the afterlife. And third point, they were affirming, he said, that God knows universally and doesn't know particular things. We can, if you want, in the conversation, discuss those points, but I'm not going to get into those technical aspects. So apparently, Ghazali would be on the same ground. I would still argue that this is not the same thing, because Ghazali indeed, at bottom, was himself a philosopher. When philosophers answered his own attacks, they actually said that much. One who answered his attacks is probably better known even than him, which Averroes, who lived in southern Spain in the 12th century. And Averroes never took seriously the attacks from Ghazali. He was saying, well, yeah, okay, he's accusing us of being even heretics, but if you read him carefully, he is truly one of us. Which is true, in fact, when you look at the works of Al-Ghazali. Not only did he write himself philosophically, but he was the one who wrote the best textbook about philosophy, which became a textbook about philosophy in the medieval ages when it was translated into Latin. He said, I'm going to write a book in which I'm going to explain to you what the doctrine of philosophers are. And then I will write a book refuting them. But his first book became an excellent textbook about philosophy. So I would say that I call Ghazali in my book the Janus of Islamic philosophy, having two faces. One face as the one who attacked philosophy, and the other face as himself a philosopher and very eloquent and committed advocate for pluralism, actually, openness and tolerance. So with that point on Ghazali, I finish my first point, and I would like now to look at the second point, having given you hopefully an idea of where the history of that controversy in Morocco comes from and what it tells us. Now I would like to look at the meaning of teaching philosophy today in Muslim societies and countries, the reason why somehow I wrote this book of mine. First of all, this question of the necessity of teaching philosophy in Muslim societies has been raised in new terms in the Islamic world, mainly in the second half of the 19th century, because of the shock represented by colonialism. Somehow, colonialism was the shock that reminded Muslims that something had happened to them along the road that explained their current state compared to Western powers that were colonizing them. One example of such a thinking is a philosopher, Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who is in one chapter of my book. Jamaluddin al-Afghani, in principle, as his name indicates, should be from Afghanistan, except that, in fact, he was not. Scholars of al-Afghani has for a long time, debated where he was from. Was he a Sunni? Was he a Shia? Etc., etc. And he himself adopted many different identities and personalities. But the most recent scholarship about al-Afghani establishes that he was in fact born, because his kunya, his name total is Jamaluddin al-Afghani al-Asadabadi. So he should be born in a village called Asadabad. You have an Asadabad in Afghanistan, but you have also an Asadabad in Iran. And it looks like he was from that Asadabad in Iran. Born a Shia, educated as a Shia. Now, the reason why he himself played so much with his identity was that he did not want what he had to say to the Muslim world to be sort of impeded and hampered by any question of identity. He did not want people to question who he was and was he speaking as a Sunni, was he speaking as a Shia, instead of just paying attention to what he had to say. So he was not truly cheating with his identity, he was dismissing that kind of identity and the kind of sectarianism that would come with questions such as, is he Sunni or is he Shia, which indeed has absolutely no importance at all. Jamaluddin Afghani, the reason why I'm quoting him is that precisely because he was a Shia, in fact, has been raised in the tradition of studying philosophy. It has been said that the discipline of philosophy had almost disappeared in the Islamic world following the death of Averroes in 1198. That is not true. People who say that Western scholarship on Islamic philosophy actually are just paying attention to the Western part of the Islamic world. In the Shia world, the tradition of studying philosophy has, in fact, never stopped. For one simple reason, it is that the doctrine of Imams, the Shia imamology, had found a good translation in Neoplatonic terms. So Neoplatonism became the language in which the doctrine of the Imams was expressed. So Neoplatonism has always been a tradition in the Shia world. The like of Ayatollah Khomeini and so on are well trained in Neoplatonism because it is part of the curriculum. So there it existed. And Al-Ghafani himself was raised in that tradition. But when he was talking about philosophy, he was not talking about that Neoplatonist tradition. He was talking about repeating in modern times the same gestures of opening up to the doctrine of modern philosophy. And in particular, he was saying we cannot just repeat Neoplatonist philosophy and keeping the Aristotelian closed world in a modern world where we have moved from the closed world of Aristotle and Ptolemy to the open universe of modern cosmology and modern science. And in addition to that, he was saying that actually the very spirit of modernity is not in technology. Do not be fooled by Western technology. Do not think that modernity is in technology. The true modernity is in the philosophical spirit of which technology is just an external consequence. That is one aspect of this claim for philosophy. Now, I come back, having said that, I come back to the Moroccan events surrounding the textbook. In fact, the Moroccan teachers were so swift to oppose anything that looked like an attack on their discipline in the name of freedom of thought and democracy, because they were right to refute the notion that Islam as such is in opposition to philosophical thinking. And in so doing, they are speaking on behalf of the long intellectual and spiritual history of examining and questioning that also defines Islam and that was constituted during centuries in that openness and in conversations with other intellectual traditions and figures. So Islamic philosophy has always been a tradition that was constructed, established in conversation with other figures, Plato, Aristotle, or Plotinus in the ancient times, Nietzsche, Bergson, and others today. And the reason why it is important for Muslim societies to connect or to reconnect with that is that first and foremost, it is their tradition, intellectual and spiritual. And second, because it conveys the spirit precisely of pluralism and tolerance that has been always fostered by that tradition of Islamic philosophy. To give you an example, philosophers in Islam, from Al-Farabi to Al-Ghazali himself, have always taught the spirit of pluralism, the affirmation that pluralism is not necessarily relativism. You are not being relativist when you are a pluralist. On the contrary, you are affirming the existence of truth. But what you are saying is that truth is refracted in many different ways. You are not saying that anything goes, which is the word of relativism. You are saying there is one truth, and that truth is reflected in many different ways. And that is an important reflection and consequence of the teaching of philosophy in the Islamic world. That would be the reason why affirming the necessity to teach philosophy in Muslim societies and countries is something to be heard. So that such a tradition of openness and pluralism should be found in textbooks as a heritage to be transmitted to students in Muslim countries is a lesson to be learned from the Moroccan teachers' protests. I end with that second point, and I consider very quickly the third point before I open it to discussion. Now, the third point announced is making Islamic philosophy a component of the curriculum everywhere, not just something that is important for Muslim societies and countries, but something that is important for everybody. What the intellectual tradition of philosophy in the Islamic world manifests is that the history of philosophy, as it was constructed mainly in the 19th century in Europe, as something quintessentially Western, is precisely that, a simplification. Because starting at the end of the 18th century and during the 19th century, philosophers, mainly Hegel, has constructed the history of philosophy as something first Greek, then Roman, then Christian European, then modern European, etc., etc., which is a misleading simplification. Medieval thought has coined the Latin phrase translatio studii in the singular or translatio studiorum in the plural to express that idea that Greek sciences had been transferred to Rome and from Rome to the Christian Western European world. And here I have mentioned earlier that in fact in 529 Emperor Justinian had closed the schools of Athens and Alexandria, and that philosophers had to flee when many of them found refuge in Iran, in Persia, in present-day Iran, places like Nishapur, Gundishapur, etc., etc. So that translatio studiorum, if you want to look at it, the transfer and translation of Greek philosophy was not just the linear, did not follow the linear path from Athens to Rome and from Rome to Leiden, Heidelberg, London, and Paris. It also, the translatio studiorum was also from Athens to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Cordoba, from Cordoba to Qayrawin, Qayrawin to Timbuktu, present-day Mali, for example. A place in Timbuktu where people were studying Plotinus, Plato, or Aristotle, or the logic of Aristotle, centuries before European presence in Africa. Once again, it is our total ignorance of that aspect of things that would let us believe that philosophy is the essence of Europe, the telos of Europe, as Husserl famously said. The very identity of Europe, I mean, it is not. Even if you consider only Greek philosophy, not to mention Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, etc. Even if you consider only Greek philosophy, well, Greek philosophy has traveled much further than just going from Athens to Rome and from Rome to Heidelberg. And it was present in Timbuktu, which was a center of exchange, an intellectual center, far, far before it was so-called discovered by René Caillé, which is a very interesting way of seeing history. History is a history of lands and regions that are discovered by Europeans. So Timbuktu was this important center, had a very long history of exchanges between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world, and on the other side, the Middle East. But it only existed in history when just an adventurer named René Caillé, whose only claim to fame is to have stumbled on that city, has discovered it. So if we restitute that understanding, that full understanding of the history of philosophy, actually we would be better historians of philosophy. And we should pay attention here to what Roger Bacon, in his Opus Tertium, wrote about that translatio studiorum in relation to the tradition of philosophy in the Islamic world. He described the voyage of philosophy in these terms. I quote Bacon: God first revealed philosophy to his saints and gave them the laws. It was thus primarily and most completely given in the Hebrew language. It was then renewed in the Greek language, primarily by Aristotle. Then in the Arabic language, primarily through Avicenna. But it was never composed in Latin and was only transferred based on foreign languages. It's very interesting that he is totally dismissive of Latin. Latin has never invented anything, just received stuff, while Hebrew had really carried the wisdom, the love of wisdom, followed, he said, by Greek, followed, he said, by Arabic. That Arabic aspect of thing has been wiped out in the history of philosophy by what Hegel, the way in which it was reconstructed by Hegel, that could be called an ethnic cleansing of the history of philosophy. Medieval philosophy in particular should be understood as an encounter between Islamic, Jewish, and Christian philosophies. And for example, medieval thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, people can study Thomas Aquinas in total ignorance of Islamic philosophy, which is strange because when you do that, you just forget that before he was canonized and became Saint Thomas Aquinas, Thomas was actually accused of being heretic. And his heresy was the accusation of being Averroist. So if you are studying Thomas Aquinas, at least you should be asking yourself, well, who is this Averroist? And why was Thomas Aquinas accused of being an Averroist? And then you start reconstructing the history of medieval philosophy as a braid of histories integrating Jewish philosophy, Islamic philosophy. So this is why philosophy in general needs to know about that. Generally speaking, there is not such a thing as a unique European philosophical telos, and textbooks on the history of philosophy should reflect the fact that philosophical thought is found in every human culture. So on important notions such as truth, reason, belief, life, etc., those textbooks should restitute for the critical thinking of students the conversations that philosophers from different traditions have entertained. And I'm very happy we mentioned the collaboration between University Sheikh Anta Diop and Nijmegen. You see, I'm saying it fast now. Nijmegen University. And this is very important because one of the bases for that collaboration is about intercultural philosophy, and I'm very happy that this is the case here in this civilized department of philosophy of Nijmegen University. And to this double aspect of the question, the necessity for Muslim societies to reconnect with their own intellectual tradition and the necessity for philosophy departments everywhere to open up to that philosophy, that is the contribution I have tried to make with my own book. And I thank you very much for listening to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Diagne, for your lecture.
Thank you.
Welcome, even van der Zweerde. Yes, let me start. You started your lecture by telling us about the situation in Tunisia, where philosophy teachers had a sit down to to criticize a passage in a certain textbook, which seems
Morocco.
Oh, sorry, Morocco.
Yeah.
Yes, which seemed to say that philosophy and Islam do not go together. So that were the teachers. I was interested in. You are a teacher at Columbia University, so of course you speak a lot of young students. I'm sure also in Senegal, your home country, and a lot of young people. And even today here, there's a lecture hall full of students. And this afternoon, you met some students of our Nijmegen Muslim Student Association.
Nijmegen, I knew that.
Yeah, never mind
Mine
the G.
was not
It's the
fine.
G. Never mind.
Here we go. All right.
So I was wondering, do you see a difference between generations? Do young people have a different perspective on the relationship between philosophy and religion, or Islam in this case?
They come to have it. In fact, my teaching is really oriented toward precisely that understanding. Mm-hmm. So I was telling a few colleagues that when I started teaching Islamic philosophy, it was really in response to precisely the type of questions I thought that younger generations were asking themselves about their own intellectual tradition. Yes. What does it say about philosophy? What does it say about critical spirit, critical thinking? What does it say about questioning, simply? And I thought that it was our duty as a Department of Philosophy in Senegal, it was then in Senegal, in a country which is Muslim, 95% of Senegalese are Muslim, to precisely teach that this was indeed the case, that you had a tradition of philosophical questioning and philosophical skepticism. I have a quote from Al-Ghazali. I don't think I put it in my book, but here it is. He says, he who doesn't doubt does not examine, and he who does not examine does not believe. And you cannot imagine a better tribute to critical thinking than such an affirmation coming precisely from someone who has been considered the main attacker of philosophical thought.
And how did your students react?
And my students react very well to that. I believe that the kind of reaction I had from my students and that I have from younger people who read my book is that they are very happy to have a kind of intelligent account of their own intellectual tradition and to learn about that intellectual tradition, because they had the sense that this is something they could use to speak about who they are, especially when they are younger generations of Muslims who grow up in countries like the Netherlands or Europe or Northern America. They want to know about that tradition of theirs.
Why especially them? Why especially young Muslims growing up in the Netherlands or the US? Or
because they are probably the ones who have more questions about who they are. They are the ones who are very likely to sort of be confronted with what I would call a crisis of transmission.
Yes, can you explain that a little bit?
Transmission of their own religion, transmission of their culture is not something always very easy. Even from parents to children, it doesn't work all the time well.
Yes.
So in some respect, they are still deeply emotionally connected to their religion, but what does it mean, that religion? What does it tell them? And especially when they live in countries and societies where people give the impression that Islam was born on 9/11/2001. Before that, Islam was not part of their existence. So everything see as Islamic has a connection with 9/11 or events such as 9/11. So the simple fact that Islam was not born yesterday, but in 610, if we adopt that date, is an important thing. And that is something that the younger generation, among them my own students in Dakar, in Colombia, even Nijmegen,
almost, yes,
would connect to.
So then, are you also saying that people, young Muslims living in secular or quasi-secular societies, have a different way of maybe choosing for their religion than people living in Muslim countries?
I think that, well, being in different circumstances make them obviously react in different ways.
Yes.
When I was teaching at Sheikh Anta Diop University Islamic philosophy, I was teaching basically to people who were surrounded everywhere by Islam and a sort of natural understanding, what they thought was a natural understanding of what Islam was.
Yes.
Although the class itself was also meant to trouble the kind of relationship, of immediate relationship they thought they might have with their own surrounding culture. But the situation would be different, indeed, with students coming from Muslim backgrounds, themselves Muslims or not, but who are interested and curious about this intellectual and spiritual tradition of theirs.
Yes. I'm also asking because I think, especially here in the West, maybe also the US, as you say, people think that Islam was born with the Twin Towers, or that at least the impression that Muslims are radicalizing very quickly. And when I asked you, Evert, when we were talking about your book and about this discussion, I said, well, I've read somewhere that your work is described as the work of a voice in the wilderness, and in Dutch that expression says a voice in the desert. So I asked Evert, do you agree? Do you think this is a voice in the desert? And then you said, well, I don't think it's a voice in the desert, but it's probably a voice in an increasingly smaller oasis. So could you explain that a little bit, and maybe you can react?
I can explain that. It is when I read your book, I read it in French first, and then I read the indeed beautiful translation by Paul. One of the things that I thought, and that was reflected also in some of the reviews that have appeared in the Netherlands of the Dutch translation of your book, is that, well, this is a very nice story, and this is all very eloquent, and it's very sympathetic, and it's very profound, and it is very honest also. But this is marginal within the world of people who... Well, it's a minor influence on the mindset of people who somehow connect themselves to the tradition of Islamic faith. So a voice in the desert, or a voice in maybe a decreasing part of the worldwide Islamic community, and maybe that is not the right picture. Maybe our picture of the Islamic world is indeed heavily influenced by the press, by the media, by a kind of received view about Islam shared by many people who have no idea about Islam. But the question would be, what do you yourself see as the possible impact or the possible resonance of your discourse among Muslims, young Muslims, in Muslim minds, so to speak, people who I think in many cases indeed are torn between different identities, of which their religion is one, and who become suspect as soon as they emphasize the religious part of their identity and not the other parts of their identity, like being American or Dutch or whatever they are.
That's indeed a good analysis of what the situation is. One always have a tendency where, when one is in a given field, to see all the people who are also in the field and have a sense that there is a movement. But in this case, I believe that mine is not an isolated voice. I mean, I'm connected with networks of like-minded people from whom I learn a lot and with whom I am in conversation in many different countries, in Morocco, in France, in the United States where I live, and so on and so forth. So I do have the sense that the continuation of a form of reform thinking, this idea that the Muslim world at one point had undergone some form of petrification in its own thinking, the religious thinking of Islam, not Islam, but the religious thinking of Muslims about Islam, and that it is time for the religion to reconnect with its own principle of movement. I believe that that way of seeing things is gaining traction and is developing. It is true that we live in a world where the evocation of Islam is the evocation of the sound and fury that goes with it. And of course, a voice is barely heard when the surrounding atmosphere is sound and fury precisely. But one has to believe in the force of education. Education has effects that are not visible immediately and that do not make as much noise as a bomb, obviously. But it is the most powerful force possible. And something that encourages me is when I meet young people in Senegal, age of my own children, for example, who just tell me that my book, that they read my book and it gave them something to think about. And it taught them, the best thing I have heard is someone telling me that it taught him what he was thinking. Because this is a statement I have myself used when I considered Indian philosopher Muhammad Iqbal as someone who was very, very important in my intellectual life. I have said that he taught me what I was thinking. To hear that very same phrase from someone, I don't know if he had heard something about me saying that or not, but it almost, it encouraged me. And I believed in teaching because that's the only thing we do. We teach and we write about what we teach. We are learning almost as much from our students as they are learning from us. And we try to restitute to them what we are learning from them, from just trying to teach them these matters. So I do believe in that force as well.
Yes, that's the only thing we do, we teach, but the other thing we do is, of course, we meet people. And
we meet people.
Yes.
Indeed. And like coming here and having something, gathering people around the few chapters that I have written on authors that I love and that I read again and again, and having journalists be interested in what you are doing and writing about it, and so on and so forth. That is something important.
Yes, but I don't mean only some people travel the world meeting other people who are maybe much more different than themselves, but also developing your own perspective on certain items by just meeting someone you didn't know before, and of course has a different mindset than you do.
Exactly, and that is an experience that one has all the time.
Yes.
Anytime
exactly.
I travel, if I say, for example, to my wife and kids, okay, I'm going to the Netherlands, it's only going to be 5 days, I'll be back by Thursday, and so when I talk about that, I have the feeling that I'm opening a parenthesis and that on Thursday I'm going to close it. It never happens like that. You never come back home the same from the people you have met and the exchanges that you have had. And that is the beauty of what we are doing, and that is the beauty of traveling. So somehow, when I'm on the plane on Thursday, inshallah, I'm going to have nostalgia for Nijmegen.
Wonderful. That would be a wonderful end of the evening, but we're not that far yet. So I just wanted to say, if there are any questions from the audience, just raise your hand. I don't promise I'll get to you immediately, but I'll remember your face or your hand or whatever. Just one condition, let it be a question, a short question. So short and question, saying question mark at the end. That would be nice. Yes, I really see a question in the back.
Should I stand up or?
No, you can sit down.
Okay. You mentioned a question to him, but I don't know, maybe I'm mistake, but I didn't get the answer. That does philosophy is not accepted with Islam, because we always read the answers or fiqh, even the 2nd century, that it's philosophy way. It's not by examples. You know, when they give examples, those examples are in philosophy way. So does Islam is not acceptable anything, or the philosophy way of explanation? That's what.
I would say that it is not the case that Islam doesn't accept those. I reminded us of all the different prophetic sayings about actually the word of wisdom, and why it becomes even a duty for us to appropriate a word of wisdom wherever we find it, be it in the mouth or in the writing of someone we consider pagan. To say that on the contrary, the emphasis put by Islam on learning, and learning in general, in the sense that there is no profane knowledge, in fact. You do not divide knowledge into profane knowledge and only the true religious knowledge. And that attitude, actually, I believe, not dividing them, is encouraged by Islam. So thank you for reminding me that in the different questions that were posed to me, I let that one skip out of my to-do list.
Yeah, and maybe continuing your question, I think the general thought seems to be that religion, be it Christianity or Islam or Judaism, let's stick with the 3 Abrahamic religions, that religion sets limits to philosophical reflection. And I think you also have an opinion about that. So I'd like to hear it.
I certainly do. I think, but in my perception, but maybe I'm too much looking at the, let's say, standard picture of the development of philosophy in the western part of the world or in Europe. My impression is that historically, when philosophy took the floor, you mentioned Thomas Aquinas, let's say around that period, and until then, of course, there had been medieval philosophers, but there is a kind of opening, you can connect it to Renaissance if you like, where philosophy took the floor and theology and religion were gradually moved backstage. At least that is the common perception. I think the problem, to my mind, the problem that is at stake there is that it's perfectly fine, I think, to say that from the perspective of a religious tradition you can do philosophy. And I fully agree with you that if you look at the Holy Quran and texts that are there is a need for philosophy. But historically the problem has always been, how can philosophy be contained within the limits set by religion, and how can it be kept from transgressing those limits and becoming detrimental to religion, which... Sure.
But what is that? Can you explain that a little bit
detrimental?
More?
Or
yeah, I don't mean the word, but I mean...
No, what I mean by being detrimental.
Yes.
Well, maybe not to religion, but to theology. To theology as a master discourse. And I think this is a fair way of diagnosing the development of science in the West and of scholarship, that theology has given way to science.
Because?
Because of the critical potential of philosophical thinking.
And that critical position is that philosophy can lead to doubting the existence of God, and that is the end of... So that would be the critics of some Islamic thinkers saying that philosophy leads to disbelief.
Can lead to disbelief. Must not lead to disbelief, but can lead to disbelief.
Yes.
And that, I think, is the problem, because I fully agree with the... I find it a beautiful quote that you gave from Al-Ghazali. He who does not doubt does not examine, and he who does not examine does not believe. Fine, but he who examines may also start not to believe. And I think history shows that that is a fairly common phenomenon. So from that angle, from the perspective of political powers, but also from the perspective of religious powers, I can very well imagine the hesitation to let philosophy take the floor and engage in its critical.
Yeah, I mean, once one has said what I just said, on which we agree, the three of us, in fact, then you have all the counterexamples of all the Galileos of history, yes, where precisely the audacity to think and to think beyond things that have been sort of enshrined by theologians has been paid in with a high price. That's true. The answer I was giving was an answer about what it means for me as a Muslim to still dare examine and think critically. But you are absolutely right that once you have said things on the basis, on the foundation of principles, as they are in principle, and as they are not only allowed but maybe even recommended by their own religious text, you do have now the reality on the ground of the distribution of power and political power. And what the theologians or the jurists can have as a weight in a given society. So depending on the weight of the jurists and the way in which they consider themselves the custodians of tradition, wanting things to remain the way they are, etc., you would have reactions such as condemnation of Galileo to take the Christian church, or burning at the stake someone like Sayyid Mansur al-Hallaj in the Muslim case, although it was not science in his case. But the very idea of punishing someone not for something they have done, but something they have thought, unfortunately exists in all societies and have to do with the distribution of power rather than what the texts themselves say. I mentioned Averroes. Averroes was so bold as to, in one of his texts, not even take a defensive position to say, well, philosophy is allowed, and he even went as far as saying, well, philosophy is obligatory. Because if it is obligatory for a human being to know the Creator, and the only way of knowing the Creator is through his works, it is an obligation to know him through his works, and he says that is all that philosophy is doing. So you have that very bold type of attitude as well. But you are absolutely right, calling attention on separating things as they are in principle and things as they are in the reality of the distribution of power and the play of power and who has power.
Yes, in that respect, I find it interesting to reflect on, of course, you are right that this prohibition and condemnation of thinkers and of critical thoughts, you see it in every religious tradition and probably in every ideology. You know what I mean, it doesn't need to be a religious tradition.
It's like me with Nijmegen.
Yes, thank you, we are even then. But at least, I think for a lot of people, it seems that at this moment in time, it's especially within Islam that this discussion is going on. Why do you think that is so?
There are two things. One thing on the side of Islam needs to be said in terms of any parameters measuring the degree of education, literacy, etc., among societies. One has to recognize that Muslim societies are not the best equipped in terms of their own education in their own tradition and faith. So that is one thing. We are talking about societies that need to catch up with their own investment in education. That is one thing. And here is a religion that has praised so much education. The very first verse, the very first words of the Quran are about learning. Learn, read, etc. And we are not there. That is what I call the disconnect between Islam and its own principle in one sense. That is one aspect. The second aspect also is that the discourse about that has become a very simplified discourse that put Muslims on the defensive. When you ask questions such as, oh, is Islam compatible with modernity? Is Islam compatible with secularism? Is Islam compatible with democracy, etc.? The questions themselves are ill-formulated because it doesn't make sense. You are considering an essence here, an essence there, and you are asking if they are compatible. What are you talking about when you say Islam? And when you say secularism, which secularism are you talking about? The American one, the one from Netherlands, the French terrifying laicity, and so on, so forth. So, as I say always, if one asks me, is Catholicism compatible with secularism? I will say no. Because I know the history of France, and I know that secularism had to impose itself with the defeat of Catholicism. Catholicism was defeated by secularism in order for France to become a republic laïque. And then Catholicism found its accommodation with secularism. Today, nobody would ask the question whether Catholicism is compatible with it, because life has decided that yes. In this case, let's life decide. In other words, if we pay, if our focus is in all the aspects of the presence of Islam which are problematic or do not work, then we lose sight of the aspects where things work. Let's take the question of integration, which is so heavily posed nowadays. I'm more familiar with France, but I'm sure it is the same thing here in the Netherlands, with the fact that many Muslim-born or Muslim citizens of those countries are making their way into the mainstream society and being integrated, and it is working, and they are doing very well. In the United States, if you take the Muslims, their level of education in average is higher than the average of the American population. And I'm not just talking about Republicans, even the others. So that is a reality. But we forget that, and we focus on the pockets of problems. And I believe that here, from what I have read, that would be also the case. You have pockets of problems in Utrecht. For some reason, I believe Utrecht is mentioned as the place that converted one great philosopher from Netherlands to comparing the Quran to Mein Kampf.
Evert, I saw you looking very skeptical.
Am I looking skeptical?
Yes, sometimes.
No, I'm looking puzzled.
Okay.
And what puzzles me is perhaps, and I'm a bit playing the devil's attorney here, but what puzzles me is a question that has been puzzling me for a long time. When you say, for example, I fully agree, let me start there, I fully agree that questions of the type, is Islam compatible with democracy, are ill-formulated, because they are yes-no questions. And yes-no questions, first of all, are rarely philosophical questions, and second, rarely sensible questions. But what puzzles me is when you say, is, for example, Islam compatible with secularism? Your next question is, what kind of secularism? Is there also a possibility that you would say, what kind of Islam? Can Islam exist in the plural? Or is not one of the fundamental problems of the Islamic tradition precisely the idea of tawheed, the idea that there is only one Islam? And to an extent, this is, I think, endemic to all the monotheistic religions. Christianity somehow seems to have been able to accommodate itself to a pluralistic situation. I sense, but I'm an outsider, of course, but I have the feeling that when it comes to Islam, there is a strong tendency to always emphasize unity and to speak about Islam only in the singular. and to, as it were, resist the idea that there could be plurality within Islam. Pluralism, yes, as you just indicated, you can have different schools. Islam is famous for having 4 different legal schools, for example, and there are many other examples, but it seems that, and maybe this has to do with the defensive position that you just indicated, but it seems to be that ranks will always close and people will say, no, but there's only one Islam.
In fact, transferring Tawheed is more about the oneness of God than the oneness of interpretations and readings. But you are right on one point, is that you do have, especially nowadays, a tendency to exclusion from, in particular, one reading of Islam, saying the oneness of Islam should be a dogma. Therefore, if one thinks otherwise, that person is not a true believer. You do have that exclusivism coming from, in fact, but that being said, my way of asking which Islam are we talking about would be to emphasize, as many people who think like me do, the pluralist verses of the Quran itself. In other words, the same Quran which insists so much on the oneness of God and the power, the demand for Tawheed, but Tawheed concerning God, is also the Quran in which you find the verse which is rightly called the verse of pluralism, which says this: if God had willed so, he would have made you one single community. But he wanted to test you through your differences. And so, given your differences, you have to compete with one another in good deeds, knowing that it is only when you return to him that he will teach you about your differences. I quoted literally the Quran, what I said. And I call this the verse of pluralism, not just plurality, because it says 2 things. It says that plurality is de facto. One could say, well, it is just a fact that differences exist. It adds to that plurality is de jure as well, because it is I, God, who willed it so. And it is so much de jure that he says, about your differences, know that you are not going to sort it out here and know who is right, who is wrong. It is me who is going to explain to you what it is that you were diverging about. Now, what you do, what is your responsibility, is to compete in doing good deeds. I love this verse for many different reasons, one of them being precisely that it allows us to understand fully what should be, it's an ought to, what should be our attitude vis-a-vis plurality. And if you consider seriously that verse, that plurality is something that was willed by God himself, then you understand fully pluralism. Now, where we agree, you and I, again, it is the same thing as when we discussed science and the freedom of inquiry. What do you make of verses like that depends already on your own decision vis-a-vis pluralism.
Sure.
If you are a pluralist, a verse like that becomes very much emphasized, and you read under its light, you read the totality of the text, and you behave accordingly.
And if you are not a pluralist,
and if you are not a pluralist, you say there is one path. I am actually reproducing the tradition of the pious ancestors. And you have a certain philosophy of time, which is that time is the enemy. Because if you consider that perfection was in the past, that the perfection belonged to the so-called Salaf, the pious ancestors, and that following them, everything that could happen is only degradation, that time can only bring degradation, then you have to sort of resist time. whine against time and consider that what is up to you is to imitate as much as you could those who lived in illo tempore, in those beautiful, magnificent, perfect times. In other words, you consider that time is the only thing that time can bring is destruction. Whereas if you think along those pluralist lines, time becomes the condition for the display of being. Instead of being the enemy of being, it is the condition of the unfolding of meaning and the unfolding of being. Therefore, you are hospitable to novelty. You are hospitable to change because you are hospitable to life. It would be the same thing as having a positive philosophy of time and having a positive philosophy of life. If you are in that posture of putting yourself against time and pretending that you are imitating a tradition as it is, well, while you have reconstructed yourself that tradition, people are considering that they are, let's reproduce the tradition of the Salaf and nothing else is valid. Whoever does something different would be a kafir.
And why would people do that?
An unbeliever.
Why would people do that? I mean, there might be a lot of political or psychological reasons why people would prefer this attitude.
Of closedness?
Yes.
Because of their conception of what is the truth. The incapacity to think that truth can be many. Still be truth, and because pluralism is very difficult to think.
Yes.
Universalism, I am right, therefore everybody else is wrong, is quite comfortable. It is easy as an attitude.
Yes.
Or saying, well, anything goes. I'm not sure that anybody has truth. That relativistic attitude also is easy. What is difficult is what is in the middle. There is a truth, and the truth is reflected in multiple manners. That is very difficult to think about. And that is the demand that we are putting on ourselves. And that exclusivism, and that also has to do with game of power. I myself consider myself as a pluralist. The only sect that I do not condone is the sect that says I am the only one right, by definition, because that sect doesn't consider me to be right.
But there's another sect that you condemn, which is the sect that says I have no idea, the sect that says anything goes. So you are seeking the middle way between the positions of dogmatism on the one hand and skepticism on the other.
Between abstract universalism, exclusivist, and relativism, I think that there is a path for pluralism, yes.
And I think the phrase or the term you use for that is progressive fundamentalism. Now, I think, especially in a secular society like ours, the word fundamentalism just raises a lot of question marks, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about what you mean by progressive fundamentalism?
Yes, I was trying to articulate the following ideas. What does it mean to say, let's go back to the foundations? If we define in a very neutral way fundamentalism that way. You can either say, I am going back to the foundation, which means I am going back to the example set by the pious ancestors. I know exactly what they were doing, and I will repeat what they were doing, while you do not say that. You know, Muslims do not even know what was the position of the hands of people who prayed at the time when they were praying. Were they praying like this, or were they praying like this? You have, and nobody could tell you, because we are not going to discover anything like a picture that would be found by archaeologists who would say, oh my goodness, look at this guy, he is praying like this. So forget it. We will never know whether they were praying like this or like this. So if you consider that, you would say, deciding that they were praying like this is my decision. Like this would be also my decision. In other words, you understand something which is fundamental. is that tradition is always something for the present. I am reconstituting what the tradition is today in the present for the purpose of what I am doing in the present. If you consider that, you have a pluralist attitude. You understand that people could do differently and be absolutely right, like as you are, also yourself right. And if you are intolerant and exclusivist, you would look at someone with a bad eye because he is standing next to you in the prayer, and you would ask yourself, why isn't he doing this? You even forget that you can be wrong and that it is not important at all, unfortunately. So now I've forgotten what the question was.
What progressive fundamentalism is.
Now, that is what I call the regressive fundamentalism. You try to recapture something because your philosophy of time is that I am going to pretend that time has not existed. I am going to recapture an attitude. Progressive fundamentalism is precisely the attitude of going back not to reproduce a model that you know that you are not going to know fully, but to capture a spirit. What was in the first place the revolutionary nature of this religion? Why is it that when this religion appeared, the first people to embrace it were the dispossessed, not the powerful? The powerful was on the side of the status quo. They insisted on keeping their gods. They insisted on keeping their rituals. They insisted on keeping their own habits. Against this message, which was saying tribal law is unjust, we should establish social justice. Because tribal law was the law of the most powerful. And when you say that tribal law is abolished for equality and emancipation, then you understand why the dispossessed were the one who first embraced this religion. So when you go to that, you are trying to recapture a spirit. You are going to ask yourself, what does it mean to continue the revolutionary aspect of it? What does it mean to continue today the emancipatory aspect of it? You know, when you find Muslims on the defensive, you say, well, you know, this is something also which is always repeated. Women in Islam are unequally badly treated, etc., etc. Sometimes when you listen to people talking about Islam, you have the feeling that it is a religion of masochist women and sadistic men. And a Muslim on the defensive would say, well, my goodness, no, it came to emancipate women, etc., etc., which is true. It is not false. When you talk about polygamy, people would remind you that actually polygamy to 4 was quite revolutionary at a time when there was no limitation. So it was a limitation. So if you are, my sense of what it means to have this progressive emancipation, fundamentalism, is to ask yourself, okay, you say that this was emancipation for women. Okay, what does emancipation for women demand today? And that is my only way of being in total fidelity to the religion. Fidelity, as I have put it in another book that I have written, fidelity in that sense is movement. The movement of fidelity, as I call it, and that is what I try to articulate as progressive fundamentalism, which could appear as an oxymoron, obviously, and that was my own smiling, provocative way of doing things.
I am looking at the audience from time to time, but I don't see any hands. Yes, at the front.
You're speaking of fundamentalism, and I'm wondering, do you know how you can dissect the cultural parts that slipped into a religion? Like you said, for women was quite revolutionary, but it's a cultural part that slipped into a religion we still adhere to now. So how can we go back to 600 AD and look at what is the spirit and what is cultural, and what can we take from for now, spirit that gives us hope, and what can we leave in 600 AD and say that's cultural, we can't bring that back here, or should we bring it back here? I'm not.
Yeah, it is not always clear-cut where you can say, let me make the separation, here is culture and here is religion, because in the spirit of many people, the two are totally mingled and blended together. One way of looking at that is if I come to have the experience of other Muslims who are Muslims like myself, but doing things differently, just the simple act of comparison might teach me, oh, this has to do with my own being Senegalese rather than just something Islamic. It is not always clear-cut like that. But capturing the spirit to sort of react to the culture. Let me give you an example, which is a kind of very strong, even graphic example. Many people associate Islam with genital mutilation. Say it's Islamic. It is not. It is not, because many people whose behavior it is are not Muslim, and many Muslims do not know that practice. So the two are separate. Now, if from there you go back to history and you ask yourself, where could this association come from? Did Islam say anything about it? You realize that, first of all, it is totally absent from the Quran, obviously. And the only few unsure hadith or tradition that talk about it is that the Prophet coming to know about that custom in certain places said, oh, indeed you do that, and said, but make sure that you do not hurt or that you know. So that those traditions, if authentic, would mean that he came to know about it, did not prohibit it, but showed that it was something that he would rather not see. This is a place where one has to decide that, okay, this has existed on cultural grounds, we can do without it. And I believe that in this country, a prominent woman who is a good friend of the philosopher I was mentioning earlier today, had fought against that practice and so on and so forth, and expressed a very strong feeling against Islam on the basis of that. This is an extreme case where probably the separation between the two could be easily done in that sense. But that is not always the case. And one should not be just always trying to get rid of the cultural aspects, because it is also when there are good aspects, it is also the nature of a religion to always become culture. The way in which Islam became the culture of West Africa is not totally the same way it became the culture in Indonesia and so on and so forth, but it is one. The religion as it is one. There are aspects of the culture that are also elements of nice differences, unessential, absolutely, because when it comes to the religion itself, I am sure that if I travel to Indonesia and I enter a mosque, it is going to be the same type of prayer that I'm going to witness, the same Quran that is going to be recited. I know already what I'm going to do in that mosque. So in that sense, the culture will not be there. But at the same time, there are cultural aspects that give the people a sense that this truly, fully belong to them. Their own investment in the religion is always creating a particular type of culture surrounding that. So a religion that would be also totally detached from any kind of culture might become something very exclusivist and dangerous. You have people who would say, who would come back to that uniformity and exclusivism in the name of ridding the pure, pristine faith from all type of cultural contaminations, which is also very, very dangerous.
I think that's very interesting what you say, because I think in Holland, in the Netherlands, especially the secular or atheist people, or a lot of politicians say, well, religion, if you want to be religious, fine with you, but not in the street. You know, you do it in your, you do it in your house. Don't let other people be bothered by it. And you are now saying, but from a different angle, that this is actually a very dangerous attitude, because it sort of separates religion from the daily life.
And you have religion that is being fabricated from the internet now.
Yes.
It has no kind of cultural rooting, and people have, you know, verses detached from here and there, hadiths that are fabricated, and they are basically excommunicating everybody except themselves.
Yes.
So that would not fit within your definition of pluralism?
No, because they are by fundamentally against any form of pluralism. Pluralism is the enemy. Difference is the enemy. Becoming is the enemy. So the enemy is time, and the enemy is diversity.
And it will also imply that it is important for people who feel religious to also express themselves, maybe by wearing scarves or crosses or whatever on the street, so that other people have the chance to meet them and talk about them. Talk about it.
When I left New York, there was a campaign called Meet a Muslim, Ask Me Any Questions. People who would stand in the street and have something saying, meet a Muslim, ask me any question, and trying to have the best possible smile to engage people. But yes, indeed, that is important. We have reached a point when now, if you sit on a plane and you are calling your loved ones and say, oh, I'm on the plane, I'm going to call you when I arrive, inshallah. If someone hears you, they say, oh my goodness, he said something about Allahu Akbar or something like that. You might find yourself actually kicked out of the plane. So not only wearing scarves, but just saying something as usual for a Muslim as saying, yes, alhamdulillah, thank you for your prayers. Alhamdulillah, my goodness. So, yeah, I try to say those words, you know, mezzo voce when I'm on planes that I call.
But the people of Meet a Muslim wouldn't agree with you. They would say, do it so that you can meet people and they can ask you.
Yes, well.
Yes.
I'll see who wins Wednesday, and I'll say one, inshallah, or not on the plane when I go home.
I think that's a very good idea. Looking at the time, I see I have time for one last question. Who wants? I see a woman and a man. I'll give the word to the woman, of course.
It's a bit of discrimination, but nothing about that.
You're the first woman, so no.
Okay. I wanted to ask, you're pro pluralism, so multiple views, but there are people that are very into their own point of view, and they're using just one kind of source. How do you get these people into pluralism, you know?
Thank you. It's a very difficult question.
Yeah, I know.
I mentioned earlier my belief, my profound belief in the force of education. I really believe that being educated in pluralism, one doesn't, you know, is not born a pluralist naturally. You have a pluralist education, and this is something for which I praise my own upbringing. I have been raised in that way, you know, thinking that I am a Muslim Sunni Maliki, but it is just a birth accident. I was born in Senegal, and you are a Sunni Maliki, so this is not an achievement at all. I would expect. But then what I make of it is something which is of my responsibility. That is one thing. The second thing, you know, there is a tradition in Islam that I quote in my book that takes two different forms that actually are almost contradictory. One form says, it is supposed to be the saying of the Prophet himself, says, my community is going to be divided into 73 sects. Only one of them will be saved. So if you understand that, you are looking for the interpretation, the sect that is right, and all the others are wrong. Another version of the same saying is, my community is going to be divided into more than 72 sects. All of them will be saved except those who refuse salvation. Apparently, you have a contradiction here. It is totally, radically different. So you can have the following attitude, okay, the transmitter of the translation, of the tradition, do not agree, so one of the versions should be the right one. So whether you are a pluralist, you prefer the second one, or you are not and you choose the first one. Or you say, as I'm doing, because philosophers like to complicate things, these two versions have got to say the same thing. They are probably two different ways of seeing the same thing, and that is what I think. In fact, the 73 sects are unavoidable. As I said, you have to be born in one of those. You are born and then you find your parents, they are Sunni Maliki, you say, Hallelujah, Sunni Maliki it is. We are saved, and so on and so forth. Now, how do you reconcile that with pluralism? My response is that the right sect, the sect of those who are going to be saved, is the 74th. Of course, the tradition talks about 73. But who are the members of that 74th? Obviously, everybody is already in a category, one of the 73. The 74th is the virtual sect made up of those who think that all 73 are right. In other words, the sect of the pluralist is the sect of the people who are going to be saved, and all the others are bound to Dante's hell.
That doesn't sound very pluralistic, but okay.
Yeah, that's my violent aspect.
One of the things you said during your lecture was, there is one truth reflected in many ways, and I think, well, one of those ways we have seen tonight. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you too, Evert, for sharing your ideas and your opinions.